Morning, class, or afternoon. This is the Chapter 4 talk through for FHS 1230, your adolescent development. And the focus of today's chapter is on families and adolescents with their families. So I decided to come outside today so you'd have a little different background, but that means there'll probably be other noises happening too, but just ignore it, and I think it'll be better just to have me outside. So when we think about families and teenagers, I often first think of conflict. And if you go to the bookstore, there are books on parenting adolescents. Get out of my life, but first could you drive me and Cheryl to the mall? Why do they act that way? A survival guide to the adolescent brain for you and your teen. And your teenager is not crazy. Well, how much conflict is there really? Probably not as much as we seem to think. Parenting books and things sometimes play on stereotypes, and we know that stereotypes are not always based in fact. So probably those books are helpful in some ways and maybe hurtful in others. If the parents believe the stereotypes of the crazy teenager, the one who can't control themselves, then sometimes it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, and the teenager does behave that way, and it worsens the relationship. So I would probably think of conflict as something that happens over everyday problems, like curfews and chores and the friends you hang out with, but not necessarily the huge life-changing conflicts. One other thing to think about when you're thinking of conflict between parents and adolescents is the adolescent ages sometimes happen at the same time as the parent is going through midlife. And the midlife of parents is usually a time like of introspection and actually self-doubt for a lot of parents. So it's kind of like an overlap of crises going on. And your parents' mental health can be quite affected by these two crises going on at the same time. Parents' mental health is worse when teenagers are at home, obviously because of some conflict, but just the idea of having more people in the house. I remember with my children, it was going to football games, going to wrestling meets, going to dance recitals. Those types of things were just a scheduling thing, and it just made everything a little more hectic. And parents' mental health increases then when the teenagers leave the home. I loved having a quieter home, but then I missed the hustle and bustle and the talking with the kids and stuff like that. So, it's kind of a two-edged deal. And then you would think that the mothers would be the most affected when the teenagers leave home, but scientists have found that it's actually the fathers who do. So that was kind of an interesting thing. And remember that not everyone follows these stereotypes. Maybe you have a teenager with very little conflict, or maybe you conflicted very little with your parents, and that's okay. And not only do people change, but families change. Parents can become part of the thing called the sandwich generation, which is where they feel like they are sandwiched in between the needs and taking care of their children and the needs and taking care of their aging parents. And to be in the middle of that is pretty difficult. You kind of feel like you don't have any time to yourself, and that becomes sometimes a mental health issue. Ethnic groups have also unique challenges when they conflict, because sometimes the familism, the loyalty to your family conflicts with the American idea of individualism. And there's a thing called generational dissonance, and that is the different views between immigrant parents and their children if they're American born. And it's just like a conflict in culture and wanting to be more American or less American, or, it's just a thing called generational dissonance. And they found that stress and conflict are higher in Latinx families, where a lot of times the children are more acculturated than the parents are. And researchers say, just distract yourself when you're going through that kind of conflict. Don't sit and argue back and forth, but find something else to do for a while and then come back to it after that. So speaking of parenting, I'm sure you've heard of these parenting styles. Let me find them in my book. They're actually I use them quite a lot in different classes that I teach. So the first one is authoritarian. An authoritarian is where the parent seeks to be the ultimate authority. They're like, you do it my way or it's the highway. They expect obedience. There's not a lot of warmth. It's just, I'm the boss, you're the child, do what I say. Indifferent would be probably the opposite of that, in which there is no demand on the child, no real communication, no real warmth. It's just kind of that they're withdrawn and absent and emotionally. Indulgent parents are the ones who love the child, they're involved with the child, but they let them do whatever they want. Sometimes that's called permissive parenting. It's really quite interesting to see these things out in real life. So sometimes if you want to have some fun, look around at the different family parenting styles, and it's kind of fun to see if you can predict which one it is. Authoritative tends to be the one that promotes the most intellectual development and the most maturity, and that's where the children have some say in decisions and rules that that are going to go on in the house, and so that the children can buy into them and understand the whys, and they're more likely to follow those. Authoritative parents also give their children the most independence that the child can handle. And sometimes that's a judgment call, but at least you're giving the child the chance to show their independence and show what they can do. Of course, this is the preferred type of parenting, and it's rare that everybody is in the authoritative thing for all the time. We all slip into different times at different times in our lives. So those are the four. There's a table 4.1 in your book that is really good about the 10 basic principles of good parenting. And it says, here's what all parents, regardless of their child's age, should keep in mind. And that, and there are 10 things. I encourage you to read those because they're just good parenting styles, but it's good for any relationships. Let's look at some sibling relationships. Some people, when you say sibling relationships, roll their eyes and, oh yeah, my brothers used to beat me up all the time. My husband comes from a family with 5 boys, and he's kind of right in the middle, and he remembers both sides of it. And I come from a family with, I only have one brother who's 12 years younger than I am. So I didn't really have a lot of sibling relationships growing up, although we're fine now. But sometimes it's like culture, conflict and rivalry, nurturance and support, kind of it goes back and forth. Um, and sometimes adolescents think kind of negatively about their siblings, um, and they prefer their peer groups. Um, but sometimes siblings can really help if you're going through a hard family time, like divorce or unemployment or something like that. Siblings can help you actually with that because both of you, or many of you, are going through the same thing at the same time. Okay, so let's look about how genetics and environment influence behavior. Sometimes it's called nature versus nurture. Nature means your genetics and what is given to you, and environment and nurture means, the things that go on in your everyday life. Um, how much do genetics affect things? We know genetics affects things like alcoholism, and if you are um, prone to violence, a lot of people will say there's some genetics, but we don't know how much. Mental health issues sometimes are partially genetic. Most things, of course, will be some sort of mixture of both. Um, and what's interesting is the field that it's called is behavioral genetics. And it's actually quite interesting. They study things, like siblings, and if you have the same environment, but you have two different people, is that why they turn out so differently? Or which parts of them are different, which parts are the same? Um, whether siblings, um, whether they react positively or negatively to each other, does that have anything to do with the environment? Um, and usually they love studying identical and fraternal twins in situations like this. In one of the old 1500 books, they had 90-year-old twins who hadn't known each other their whole lives. They grew up together and then grew apart for their whole adult life and just got back together. And they're supposedly identical, which we don't know for sure, I guess. But because of the environment, one is like a foot taller than the other. And the other one looks like they had a real hard working life. They have arthritis and were, kind of looked like they had a harder life. And that was kind of interesting because then you can study genetics versus environment. And of course, always we have to talk about divorce and remarriage because it seems to be pretty prevalent. Um, Divorce increased in the 1960s all the way to the 1980s, and then it peaked in the 1980s, and now it's declining. Thank goodness. And they're not sure why it's declining, other than maybe less people are getting married, so the divorce, rate would be less. Sometimes it's the percents, we don't know exactly. And you need to take that marriage and family class if you're interested in these types of things to study. Divorce is less common among college graduates than non-graduates, and the divorce rate is higher in remarriages. Um, I think that's kind of true, because in remarriage, there's not just the two of you, like usually in the first marriage, but there's children, there's new in-laws, there's all sorts of family dynamics, there's economics. And so I think the remarriage rates have a lot to do with the things going on outside of just the couple. Also, a strong extended family is nice because they're supported, and they can kind of help buffer the children from a lot of the effects of just like a single parent family. It's pretty interesting that there have been studies saying, like, if a couple gets married and one of the couple is from a divorced family, um, then they have a certain percentage chance of their marriage not working and ending in divorce. But if both people come from divorced families, then the percent is like double. So it does have an effect on people. And so I think what you kind of do is try to mitigate. Well, first try not to divorce, but sometimes that's not possible. It's interesting that with remarriage, girls more than boys are affected, and the older kids more than the younger children are affected. And of course, a step parent is very difficult. to get used to, even if they're a great step parent. And you can imagine the step parent being confused because they kind of go into the relationship with the new children as I'm a good thing happening to this family, and why don't they like me? And it can kind of be confusing as to, the different things that they encounter. Okay, one of the hard things on families is the effects of poverty. If you are in persistent or chronic economic strain, it just undermines the parental effectiveness. Parents become more harsh with their kids and more depressed themselves, less involved with their families. They argue more with everybody. They tend to be stricter, I think, so that they have control over things. And it is a very difficult situation for both people. The parents who are going through the economics and the children who are going through the same thing, but on a little more removed level. So, especially poverty over a long period of time has a lot of negative effects on people. We can look at the different family forms, which is like single families, single parent families, blended families, remarriages, gay or lesbian parents, those types of things. And children who have been adopted are a family form, as well as children that are in foster care. If we look at the foster care system, oh, here we go, adopted adolescents, there we are. If we look at youth in the foster care systems, they do have more problems than adolescents not in foster care. And you could see why, because for some reason their parents are not able to take care of them, which is kind of a sense of rejection, and they are at more of a risk for homelessness if they start in foster care. And it just seems that it's hard to be resilient over a long period of time. And we saw this commercial on TV that says nobody wants foster care teenagers, and yet they still need a place to go. And so it just seems like, we need to be more cognizant of the different types of adolescents, especially if you're going to become a teacher of secondary education, which might be why you're taking this class. But when I was a secondary teacher, I know that, you have adolescents from all sorts of backgrounds, all sorts of families, and you understand and you sympathize, but a lot of times you can't do anything about their family situation, and so you just have to love them and accept them for who they are. I love this quote and it's out of your book. Across all of the health outcomes examined, the results point to the importance of family and the home environment for protecting adolescents from harm. What emerges most consistently as protective is the teenager's feeling of connectiveness with parents and family. Feeling loved and cared for by parents matters in a big way. And even though teenagers will tell you, oh, I don't care, they really do care, and it really does matter. Hey, thanks.